Okay, there was this perplexity he raised about the significance or possibility of friendship with oneself and its role in his own argument, but also the claim for human life. And here in Book 9, Chapter 8, he takes up his answer. Now notice how Aristotle works. He raises this question at the beginning of Book 9, and now he's answering it toward the end. Excuse me. And the full answer is not going to come until Book 10, because Book 10 is happiness, the special virtue that is connected with happiness, which hasn't really been mentioned by me clearly. I just said, go read it. And Book 8 will mark off, let's just recap here. The good person has acted rationally. They're in harmony with the rational part of their soul. They're morally and intellectually virtuous. When they look at themselves, they're content with themselves, and their soul is in harmony. Therefore, since their reason has been in control, they exhibit moderation or self-restraint, which is necessary for the achievement of a fully human life, as opposed to instinctual life in an animal. The unhappy person is in conflict with themselves. They're in conflict with the thing that makes them most human, which is their reason, right? And so he's just going to clarify further this issue of self-love. And now he's going to talk about self-lovers. And of course, this word, expression, is used for both the good and the bad version. He says, but there is some perplexity, too, as well, whether one ought to love oneself most or someone else. Should one love oneself most or someone else? And in fact, he's already given the answer. And the answer is, you must love yourself first before you can love anyone else. And that the two really go hand in hand. Truly loving someone else is just an extension of loving yourself. So it's not about more or less, it's a kind of equality. For people censure those who are fondest of themselves, and on the grounds that these sort of people are in disgrace, they stigmatize them as self-lovers. Now this quote-unquote self-lovers here, I think are better for us a kind of narcissist or an egoist. And these people are censured because we know that it's not appropriate to... That's the person who goes, me, 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 me. It's all about me, right? That's why a self-lover. But someone who truly loves themselves is not a quote-unquote self-lover. So that's the distinction. And of course, the self-lover, the narcissist, is by definition the base or the bad or the corrupt person. He says the base person is held to do everything for his own sake. And of course, our goal should be to do things for other people in complete friendship. And the more corrupt he is, the more he does this. People accuse him of doing nothing apart from what concerns his own good. The decent, and this is of course his good understood by his instincts, because if he was really doing what was right, there would be no problem. The decent person, by contrast, acts on account of what is noble, and the better a person is, the more he acts on account of what is noble, and for the sake of a friend, while disregarding himself. So you would first say that he asks this question, ought you love yourself or someone else the most? At first it seems like someone else. Yet the deeds are discordant with the arguments, and not unreasonably. For people assert that one ought to love one's best friend most, and that one's best friend is someone who, when he wishes for good things for a person, does so for the person's sake, even if no one will know about it. All right, that's just complete friendship, doing something for the other person's sake. But these are qualities present especially in the person in relationship to himself. Doing good for yourself, wishing well for yourself. And he's already established that one cannot do good to others until one is in the right relation with oneself. And indeed, so are all the other things by which a friend is defined, for it was said that all that characterizes friendship stems from oneself and extends toward others. Moreover, all the proverbs of the same judgment, such as one soul, the things of friends are in common, friendship is equality, and the knee is closer to the shin, I suppose, than some other part of your body. For all these things would belong to the person in relationship to himself most of all. He is most a friend to himself, and so one ought to love oneself most. This is one of those wonderful rare moments where Aristotle actually unequivocally states his position. It never happens. But the point here is, this obtains when one is a good, decent, serious, noble person. When someone is corrupt or base, as he says, this relationship cannot obtain unless they change their life. Therefore, there is understandably perplexity as to which view is right to follow, since both have credibility. All right, in fact, so maybe the second conclusion about loving oneself most of all is, in fact, just a hypothetical that he now needs to analyze. Perhaps then one ought to take apart such arguments and determine the extent to which, or in what respect, each is true. What are the two arguments? That the highest thing to do is good deeds toward another, or the highest deed is good deeds toward oneself. If therefore we should grasp how each side is speaking of the self-lover, perhaps the matter would become clear. Okay, we're speaking about two self-lovers, one good and one bad, or two forms of self-love. And now then, those who bring self-love into reproach are called self-lovers. So there's two forms of self-love. The people who bring it into disrepute or reproach are the narcissists, the quote-unquote self-lovers. That's the expression he uses for these people. Those people who allot to themselves the greater share of money, honors, and bodily pleasures, for the many long for these things and are serious about them on the grounds that they are what appears to be best. Hence, too, such things are fought over. Those who grasp for more of these things gratify their desires, and in general, their passions and the non-rational part of their soul. What is a human most? A human being is most the thinking part of them, and Aristotle identifies that as their intellect. Their intellect. So if you're satisfying your passions, you're acting like any other animal. Those who are self-lovers in this way, therefore, are justly reproached. So they care only about themselves, but they care in the entirely wrong way. And in fact, the truth is, they just appear to care about themselves. If they're doing the wrong thing for themselves, it's very clear that they're not actually demonstrating genuine care and concern and respect for themselves. They're not truly loving themselves. That's just the appearance. It is not unclear that the many are accustomed to saying that those who allot such things to themselves are self-lovers. For if someone should always take seriously that he himself do what is just or moderate or whatever else accords with the virtues, and in general, if he should secure what is noble for himself, no one would say that he is a self-lover or blame him. Right? So this is the good form of self-love, the person who does things for themselves, but they do just things. And I think the logic here is, if you're doing righteous things for yourself, it's going to benefit others. At the very least, it's going to do no harm to others. If you think about those passions that the self-lover, in the negative sense, is satisfying, many of those passions are not only harming themselves, but they're harming other people. Think back to the Republic. Happiness for the characters of the Republic is doing what I want. And justice is doing good for others, and injustice is doing good for myself, with the implication being that doing injustice means benefiting myself at the expense of others. So these people's fulfillment of their passions are harming themselves and other people. Being good, then, doing things for yourself as a good person, is also then, I think, going to benefit others. And of course, it's going to make you be able to be genuine friends with them that you can't otherwise be. But this sort of person would seem to be more a self-lover. So he's using the word repetitiously here to talk about both phenomena, good and bad. The point is, there is true self-love and there is false self-love. And the false self-love, he characterizes people who are self-lovers, and that helps distinguish it. He allots to himself the noblest things and the greatest goods. He gratifies the most authoritative part of himself. In all things he obeys this part. What is the human being? the fully human being obeys their reason. Their soul obeys their reason, not their passions. Crucial. What is that a part? It's not just your reason, but what he's going to call the intellect. He says, previously we've already read that the thinking part of the human being is most what he is as a human being, or she. Sorry, everything's, the male pronoun here. It's really immaterial to his arguments. The point is that we are most human to the extent we identify with our intellect. And our intellect is the most distinctive feature of human nature. And therefore, it's like the kernel. It's the essence, right? And it's going to connect to the the role of the intellect is going to connect with the best and most complete single virtue that is synonymous with happiness. What is that virtue? The most authoritative part of us is our intellect, and in all things he obeys this part. So we are good, we are fully human to the extent we obey our intellect or obey our reason, and we are the opposite when we don't obey it. Just as a city and every other whole composed of parts seems to be their most authoritative part above all, so too does a human being, right? So we are what our most authoritative element in our nature really is. Just like he says, what is a human being? It's a human being when we're perfected. That makes us fully human. So we're most human when we're perfected, rather than just merely being human in the sense of DNA or human body. He says a self-lover, this is a true self-lover, therefore is especially that person who is fond and and gratifies this authoritative part. The true self-lover is the person who's truly happy, the person that's truly a friend, and they satisfy this most authoritative. Well, what activity satisfies this authoritative part, the intellect, and makes us happy? What is that? That's in Book 10. Book 10. Sorry, it's not here. And he is said to be either self-restrained or lacking in self-restraint, depending on whether or not his intellect is in control, right? So self-restraint is defined by the control of intellect or reason, on the grounds that this part is the person himself. It's not you are what you eat, you are the highest part of you, what Aristotle identifies as the intellect. If you're tired of all the rationale and all the reasoning, right? Everything's reason. Maybe it's like we're all Spock, we're all robots here. When we look at Rousseau, we're going to get a thinker who identifies the essence of a human being not with their reason, but with their sentiments, their emotions, their passions, certain passions. Amour de soi-même, he's going to call it. Sounds very romantique, right? Okay. And those deeds that are accompanied by reason, this goes back to Book 1, Chapter 7, actions accompanied by in obedience to reason, so on and so forth, seem above all to be the ones done by people themselves and done voluntarily. So satisfying the intellect, the authoritative part of us, is something done by ourselves? I thought this whole book was preaching the sociality of mankind, preaching the social relationships in the form of friendship. And now it seems like the highest form of friendship is really friendship with oneself and doing something in that relationship by oneself. Here we go. It is not unclear, then, that each person is this rational part, or is this above all, and that the decent person is fond of this especially. Hence he especially would be a self-lover, but in reference to a different form. I think he's distinguishing here the decent person is the person of moral virtue. He never tells you this. You have to figure it out. That's this book. That's Aristotle. The decent person is the being of moral virtue. The serious person is the person of intellectual virtue. And notice how he distinguishes them. He doesn't say they're the same, right? So maybe this is an argument for his priority of intellectual virtue over moral virtue. Hence he especially would be a self-lover, but in reference to a different form of it than one subject to reproach. In fact, it differs as much from this latter form as living in accord with reason is different from a living in accord with passion. Okay, he's making the simple distinction between a decent person and the base person. The decent person, positive, true self-love, happy, a true friend because they live in accord with reason. The corrupt person lives in accord with passion, right? They are a slave to their passions, quite simply. He says, now all approve of and praise those who are preeminently serious about noble actions, and if all compete with a view to what is noble, and exert themselves to the utmost to do what is noblest, then in common there would be all the necessities for each individually the greatest goods, if in fact virtue is of such a character. As a result, the good person ought to be a self-lover. Ought to be. He will both profit himself and benefit others by doing noble things. So we see the problem reiterated and solved. But the corrupt person, the bad self-lover, quote unquote, ought not to be. He will harm both himself and his neighbors since he follows his base passions. In each case of the corrupt person, then, what he ought to do and what he actually does are in discord. This is it. This is why he's in conflict with himself. What he ought to do and what he does do are in conflict with each other, because what you ought to do is based on your reason, and what you do is based on your passion. And this person knows that rationally what they should do, but they succumb to their impulses nonetheless. So therefore their soul is in conflict. Right? Aristotle says, every intellect chooses what is best for itself. Now, boy, that's a really interesting claim, because what is best for itself? Aristotle, this entire text, has told us that what is best is objective, and it's not for ourselves. It's just what we should want as a human being, and that there's a basic commonality which unites all of us, a human nature, that we all should be seeking effectively the same thing. But here he says every intellect chooses what is best for itself, and the decent person obeys the rule of his intellect. It is true in the case of the serious person. Now, it's very clear that the decent person and the serious person are not exactly the same thing. And it's also, I think, clear that what he cares about most is the serious person, right? And that's interesting, because our moral compass says that the decent person should be prized most of all. In the case of the serious person, that he does many things for the sake of both his friends and his fatherland, and even dies for them if need be. He will give up money, honors, and in general the good things that are fought over, thereby securing it for himself what is noble. So he's starting to put what goods matter to happiness. They start transcending even honors and money. In a nutshell, we could just say doing what is right. He would choose to feel pleasure intensely for a short time over feeling it mildly for a long one, to live nobly for 1 year over living in a haphazard way for many, and to do one great and noble action over many small ones. And he goes on to say, but it is possible, too, that he forego in favor of his friend the performance of certain noble actions, and that it is nobler for him thus to become the cause of his friend's actions than to perform those actions himself. So there's one person who's assisting in the action and another person actually performing. In all praiseworthy things, therefore, the serious man manifestly allots more of the noble to himself, So to compare to the decent, and then the decent compared to the base. In this way, then, one should be a self-lover, as has been said, but in the way that the many are, one must not be. Right? So clearly, the conception of narcissism is not what one should seek, this higher form of self-love. Then chapter 9. I don't have it here, but I'm going to read the first sentence. There is a dispute, too, regarding the happy person, namely, whether or not he will need friends. Huh? There is a dispute regarding the happy person, namely, whether or not he will need friends. Now, I thought this question was clearly answered in Book 1. In Book 1, Aristotle says, activity in accord with virtue, and then, in addition, a complete life, and a complete life involves time and external equipment, including friends. It seemed patently clear and obvious. Friendship is the very topic of Books 8 and 9, and naturally it has to do with friendship with other human beings. He says, for people assert that those who are blessed and self-sufficient have no need of friends. Self-sufficient? Well, he said by definition human beings are not self-sufficient. Or actually the definition he gave of self-sufficiency was when you had sufficient external goods to satisfy your needs. He who is self-sufficient has no need of friends, since the good things are theirs already. So notice, happiness, Aristotle from the beginning, has not wanted to make it dependent on chance, not wanted to make it dependent on accident, want to make it dependent on your own actions, your own abilities, and not even on the actions and abilities of other people. So if you're dependent on your friends for your happiness, you're in a bind, because if they're not there, you've lost your happiness as well. And that since the happy are self-sufficient, they have no need of anyone in addition, whereas a friend, since he is another or different self, provides only what someone is unable to provide on his own. Hence the saying, when a daimon gives well, what need of friends? Now let's be clear. Up to this point, Aristotle has absolutely celebrated the concept of friendship. Righteous deeds toward one another, and now he's talking about a person who does not need other people. The question is, what is it that they do that allows them to satisfy themselves in this way? The answer seems to be found in Book 10, Chapter 7. The chapter that concludes Aristotle's discussion of happiness that bookends, notice happiness bookends the entire text. He says this, and happiness, self-sufficiency is having everything you need for your basic needs, right? Happiness is the need. So what does this full notion of self-sufficiency look like that's so full that one does not seem to need other people to fulfill it? If happiness is an activity in accord with virtue, it is reasonable that it would accord with the most excellent virtue, and that this would be the virtue belonging to what is best. That's exactly what we've seen in the first couple books. Whatever this is the intellect or something else that seems naturally to rule, to command, to possess intelligence concerning what is noble and divine, whether it itself is in fact divine or the most divine of things, the activity of this is in accord with the virtue proper to it, would be complete happiness. Complete happiness? Huh? I thought happiness was already complete. And this activity is contemplative, has been said. So what is the thing that commands, that rules, that possesses intelligence, that commands our life, that should command, ought to command our life? It's our intellect, right? And then the question is, what is the activity performed by the intellect? What is the virtuous? What is the activity of excellence, that is happiness, that is performed by the intellect? It is activity that is contemplative. Activity that is contemplative. He says this would also seem to be in agreement both with the points made before and with the truth. That's what we're looking, not opinions about the happiness, but the truth. For this activity is the most excellent one. The intellect is the most excellent of the things in us, and the things with which the intellect is concerned are the most excellent of the things that can be known. Further, this activity is continuous, for we are more able to contemplate continuously than we are able to do anything else whatever. We also suppose that pleasure must be mixed into happiness, and the most pleasant of activities, in accord with virtue, is agreed to be the one that pertains to wisdom. At any rate, philosophy seems to have pleasures that are wondrous in purity and stability, and it is reasonable that those who are knowers conduct their lives with greater pleasure than do those who are seeking knowledge. Then he talks about self-sufficiency. The happiest person seems to be the most self-sufficient person. And what's the argument here? If happiness is the virtue or activity of contemplation, the Greek word is theoria, one can be totally self-sufficient, or as close as a human being can come to self-sufficiency, because you can do it under your own powers without the extended assistance of other human beings. He says the self-sufficiency spoken of would pertain especially to the contemplative life. For a wise person, just a person, and all the others are in need of the necessities of life. But when these necessities have been supplied sufficiently, the just person needs others toward whom and with he will act justly. The just person is the person of moral virtue. And similarly with the moderate person, the courageous, and each of the rest. He's listing off here the moral virtues, justice, moderation, courage, and so on. The wise person, by contrast, is capable of contemplating even when by himself, and the wiser he is, the more capable of doing so he will be. Nonetheless, he is most self-sufficient. In addition, contemplation alone would seem to be cherished for its own sake. It's an end in itself, and ends in themselves are higher than means. For nothing comes into being from it apart from the activity, the contemplating itself. Now this goes back to the very first page of the Ethics, where he distinguishes between activities that produce things in addition to themselves, and activities which are ends in themselves. And contemplation is understood as an end in itself, because it doesn't produce anything than what it actually is. But for matters bound up with action, we gain something. Action actually is a technical term here that implies moral action, doing virtuous, moral virtuous deeds. We gain something to a greater or lesser degree apart from the action itself. So what does he say? Just to close off this conversation here. He says, it would be strange then if a person should not choose the life that is his own, but rather that of something else. Something, not someone. Something else means another type of being. The life that is our own is the one that is most in accord with the highest principle of our being, which is our reason and intellect, and the intellect is engaged in contemplation as its highest activity. What was said before fits well now too, for what is proper to each is by nature most excellent and most pleasant for each. What is proper to you is the thing that most distinguishes you as you. And so he says, to conclude, and so for a human being, this is the life that accords with the intellect. If, in fact, this especially is a human being, the life, therefore, is also the happiness. It is the happiest. but for the life that accords with the other virtues is happy in a secondary way. He says, but the life that accords with the other virtue, moral virtue, is happy in a secondary way. For the activities that accord with such virtue, notice he doesn't mention it clearly, are characteristically human ones. It is in relationship to one another that we do what is just, courageous. So moral virtues deal with relations with other people and whatever else accords with the virtues. And if the intellectual virtues do not accord with the other people, then the highest life, interestingly, is a less than social life. This is interesting. And whatever else accords with the virtues by observing closely what is fitting for each person in contracts, necessary services, and all manner of actions, as well as in matters involving passions. And down the page he says, contemplative virtue would also seem to need little in the way of external equipment, or less than does moral virtue. Remember, one of the requirements of heaven is equipment. And contemplative virtue, contemplation, involves less of a need because you have it. It's not external. It's more and more internal, and therefore you're more capable of being self-sufficient. So if we turn the page to conclude, he says on page 228, page 228, he says, but none of the other animals are happy. They're not capable of it, since they in no way share in contemplation. Happiness, then, is also coextensive with contemplation, and the more contemplation is possible for some, the happier they are, not accidentally, but in reference to the contemplation. For it is in itself honorable. As a result, happiness would be a certain contemplation. So how does he define happiness here? It's contemplation. Now, very briefly, let's connect Aristotle's concept, full concept of happiness in with these two versions of self-love, good and bad. Happiness is activity in accord with virtue or rational virtues, and if there are many, the best and most complete one. And clearly we see here a sliding scale of happiness. He mentions happier and happiest. Contemplation is the best and most complete virtue. Full stop. Theoria. Contemplating the order of things. Right? But moral virtue, it makes for a decent person. Intellectual virtue, and the pyramid, the capstone of the pyramid of intellectual virtue theory, makes for a serious person, right? And there's a sliding scale of happiness then. It's not quite as simple as we thought at first. And then we get to the issue of the positive form of self-love, in which reason rules in the soul, and we are in conformity with ourselves. To say we're in conformity with ourselves, we're in conformity with our own nature, not our individual nature, but our nature as human beings, right? And therefore we're content with ourselves, and we can be friends with ourselves, and therefore we are increasingly self-sufficient, and the person who engages in contemplation is identified as the most self-sufficient human being there is. The person who is base or has a corrupt soul is in conflict with themselves because their life is not in accord with their reason and their intellect. He says very simply, as a human being with your nature, your soul rules over the body, and your reason and intellect rule over the soul. In the soul of the corrupt person, the passions dictate, and the passions change. So therefore, if you're following your passions, not just are your passions changing from one day to the next, but you are changing. Your own identity is not consistent, and therefore that's another way you're in conflict with yourself, apart from the fact that you're not in harmony with yourself or in conflict, precisely because what you are as you as a human being is a rational being, and you're not fulfilling your own identity, and you're aware of that. So you feel guilt, shame, and regret as the result of not being in conformity with what you know you should be, which is another way of saying not being in conformity with what you should do. And therefore, as a result of, you have a low opinion of yourself because you know what you should do but don't do it. Therefore, you flee yourself and seek and why do you do that? Because you lack self-restraint. Whatever is preventing you, you're unable to restrain your passions by your reason. And you identify yourself not with your reason, which is most you. You identify yourself with your passions, which are just animal. Animals have the same passions, right? And what do you do to solve that problem? You flee yourself into the false appearances of other people. You present a false image to them of being good when you're not. And meanwhile, they're flattering you when they're really just trying to take advantage of you and engaging in this lower form of friendship. You're unhappy with yourself, therefore you're not friends with yourself. And then you're also not really friends with those other people. But you appear to have a lot of friends. You appear narcissistic. You appear egotistical. You are connecting yourself with all kinds of people to give you superficial recognition, which is a kind of a false cover for the suffering that you're experiencing internally. And therefore, you're the opposite of self-sufficient. You're making yourself increasingly dependent on others. And when you start to see a kind of game of popularity there, and we all know that in popularity, there's flavors of the week. The herd goes from one place to the next. So you're the Hollywood star who's getting all the adulation one season, and you've vanished the next. And because your happiness, which isn't a real happiness, but it's not nothing, is dependent on other people rather than yourself. Okay. So this concludes our discussion of the ethics. And who would have reached the conclusion at the beginning of this text that for Aristotle, happiness is essentially the life of philosophy, the life of philosophy. And we will pick up this theme when we look at Plato's Symposium, with our central figure, Socrates, who is really his life is the epitome of the life of philosophy. It's almost as if the ethics were written as a kind of technical portrait of the life and soul of Socrates.